Well, welcome everyone. This is a presentation that was originally going to be done in September, but I happen to have had surgery the day that was supposed to happen. So I apologize for that and welcome to the February edition of the same program. My talk's on Colorado gold and silver booms and busts from 1858 to 2020. Next slide. I'm going to concentrate on three different areas in Colorado. The first is the Pikes Peak boom and bust, the original boom that took place within the Colorado mineral belt. And that's that diagonal rectangle there that near the northeastern end would be the D, represents the town of Denver. The D in Durango represents the southeastern corner of that box. The northwestern corner would be about where Estes Park is, and the southwestern corner would be the town of Dolores. And almost every bit of the mining during the original Pikes Peak boom occurred within that rectangle. Actually, mostly in the northern half of that rectangle. I'm going to talk about the Leadville silver boom and bust. You can see that as number 2, right in the middle of the mineral belt. And then finally the Cripple Creek boom, bust, and boom. And that's not in the mineral belt. And that's why it was so late coming into production, and why it's still being mined right there on the west side of Pikes Peak. Next. Pikes Peak or bust was what a lot of people put on, apparently, on their prairie schooners as they came across the plains, because Pikes Peak was the only thing they knew in western Kansas, which is where Pikes Peak was at the time. And this was a fairly famous drawing from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, or Illustrated News, that shows one of the potential miners that busted before he even got here within sight of Pikes Peak. Next. Okay, within the mineral belt, we had the principal gold placer districts occurring up there at the north end of the mineral belt within that red oval. And part of the problem Colorado had in those early territorial days, or pre-territorial days, was that if you look at where those placer areas within that oval are located, there's a county line that kind of runs right down the middle of the long axis of the oval. Well, that's the Continental Divide. And the part of that oval that's on the east side of the Continental Divide was in Kansas. All those districts on the west side of the Continental Divide were actually in Utah territory. So you had a mining area that was split between two territories at the time, neither of which had mining going on at that time. So basically Colorado was on its own, or the Pikes Peak gold area was on its own as far as coming up with mining laws and how to do what they were trying to do. Next slide. The Colorado Gold Rush actually was a kind of an offshoot of the California Gold Rush, because the only really experienced miners that were some of the initial 49ers in California actually came from Georgia. They were experienced because the first major U.S. gold rush occurred in northeastern Georgia in 1829. So some of these guys had 2 decades of experience before they even went to California. The the Georgia miners would follow the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory and then make it up to the Santa Fe Trail and take that to Bent's Fort, and then follow what became the Cherokee Trail from Bent's Fort up Fountain Creek and Cherry Creek to the current location of Denver, and then on up to what became the Overland Trail to get to California. And there's a famous anecdote about some poorly educated Southerner saying, "There's gold in them thar hills." Well, it really wasn't an uneducated person saying that, and he didn't talk like that, because it was actually the mint director from the Dahlonega, Georgia U.S. Mint that talked to a crowd of 49ers getting ready to leave for California, saying, "There's still gold in these hills." He was trying to keep the miners there so they could continue producing gold for his mint. But some of the gold miners from Georgia realized that they weren't going to make a fortune in California, and began leaving, within a few years. One of the groups that left were William Greenberry Russell and his brothers, who went back to Georgia about 1852 to take care of their families. But they had heard from some of the other miners that went to California in 1849, who actually were Cherokee, that they had panned some gold in a place called Cherry Creek along the Cherokee Trail. And there are other reports of gold in that area as well. So in 1857, there was a really terrible depression. You had the Bleeding Kansas preliminary to the Civil War occurring. You had a good percentage of the U.S. Army in Utah trying to put down the Mormon rebellion. Things were pretty bad, though. Bankruptcies in the East with banks and railroads. So there was a pin-up demand for something to occur to kind of bring the country back around. So in the spring of 1858, William Russell and his brothers gathered a party together in Georgia again of experienced miners. They headed for Indian Territory and picked up some of his wife's relatives. She was part Cherokee. By the time they got to what's now Colorado, they had about 110 or so people in their party, and they panned along Cherry Creek as they went north. And they did find some shows, but not anything real promising. But they did manage to pan about $400 worth of gold from the Little Dry Creek area in what's now Englewood. And but it wasn't much, so a lot of the party left and went back to Indian Territory or back to Georgia. Only a few of the party stayed on. Then in the spring of 1859, they found gold in the Idaho Springs area. And so Russell and his brothers went up to the Idaho Springs area and ended up finding some claims in what's now Russell Gulch above Central City. And those discoveries kicked off the 1859 gold rush. Probably around 100,000, nobody knows for sure, 59ers rushed to western Kansas for the gold rush, expecting in most cases to find gold nuggets lying all over the ground like they did when they had the California gold rush. And that didn't work out to their satisfaction, so about 2/3 of them left within the first couple of years after the rush began. Now, there was no 1860 census in Colorado because Colorado didn't exist. So we really don't have a very good handle on how many people stayed through that time. Denver had a population of about 4,700 people in 1860. So in that first gold rush boom from 1858 to 1867, Colorado produced approximately $14 million in placer gold and $10 million in lode gold. But you have to realize that gold was selling at that time for about $20 an ounce. So, $24 million doesn't sound like much for a decade of mining, but when you put it in today's dollars, that's about $2.2 billion worth of gold. Next slide. Then we had a bust from about 1868 to 1875. There weren't any major new gold discoveries in Colorado, not like a Central City or an Idaho Springs or a Breckenridge or those places that had already been explored. A lot of the areas, the placers by 1868 were beginning to be fairly thin, and they were even exploiting the gold veins when they were able to follow the placers up to the source areas. And even by 1868, even some of the oxidized veins that were near surface and easy to get to, and to be able to mill with the stamp mills that were being used at the time and amalgamated with copper plates coated in mercury. That easy gold was pretty much being played out by 1868, and they were in the sulfide ore in places like Central City. So a chemistry professor from Brown University named Nathaniel P. Hill was hired by some of the mine owners in the Blackhawk Central City area to try to figure out a way to smelt some of that sulfide ore. And he actually went to Wales and Germany and studied some of the processes they had in Swansea, and came back and built the smelter in Blackhawk, but it was only partially successful. They still weren't recovering nearly as much gold as they could tell was in there. And by 1872, the first railroad reached the closest mining area to the Denver area, the Colorado Central. But as soon as the railroad got there, 1873 panic occurred, and money was tight. A lot of the mines shut down. Things were pretty bleak nationwide during that Jay Cooke Northern Pacific Railroad panic. And during that period, in 1878, they moved the smelter from Blackhawk, or the Hill smelter from Blackhawk to Denver, and renamed it the Argo smelter. And if you're at all familiar with Denver, the Argo was right at the southwest corner of the intersection of Interstate 25 and Interstate 70. So not far from downtown Denver. Next slide. Okay, well, what ended that bust was Leadville. Next slide. Yeah, in the Leadville area, the first rush to that area was for gold, because placer gold was discovered in California Gulch in 1859. But they had a lot of problems separating the gold from this heavy black sand and heavy rock that kept clogging their sluices. Some of it was assayed, but the assay came back that it was just lead. And in a place as far from civilization as California Gulch was at that time, with no railroads, nobody was going to mine lead ore because there was no profitable way to get it back to the United States, especially and be able to compete with places like Galena, Illinois, that were mining lead and sitting right on the Mississippi River and had steamboat access. In 1860, Horace and Augusta Tabor opened a store in Oro City, which was in the Leadville area. And they provided grub stakes to prospectors. Horace was always a little too free with his merchandise and tended to do a lot of work on credit, but he was savvy enough to take shares in whatever those prospectors were able to find. In 1868, lode gold mining replaced most of that placer mining in California Gulch. One of the first lode mines with some fairly rich gold ore, oxidized ore, was the Printer Boy, which was very near California Gulch. Finally, in 1875, someone sent some more of that heavy rock out to be assayed, and they found it was a silver lead carbonate, fairly rich in silver. So that really started the Leadville boom, especially when one of Tabor's, two of Tabor's prospector grubstake people found the Little Pittsburgh mine, and he had a third of the mine. They had 2/3. Extremely rich silver mine, and Tabor overnight became significantly wealthier than he had been. 1877, the town of Leadville was founded, just to the northwest of Oro City in California Gulch, and within 4 years reached a population of 20,000. Now, that may not sound huge, but in 1880 census, Denver had a population of 37,000. So, and Denver had been around for 20 years by that point. Next slide. This is a map of the Leadville, some of the primary Leadville mines. That dashed line sort of approximates California Gulch. You can maybe see California Gulch kind of meandering its way down under that line toward Leadville. And the oval is around Oro City, where the original gold rush to that area occurred and where the Tabors had their store. Okay, next slide. So things really happened quickly in Leadville once things got going. In 1878, the Harrison smelter was the first one to open, but within a year, there were 17 silver, lead, zinc smelters in Leadville, including the B&E smelter, which ended up being the longest lasting. By 1880, only a year after all those smelters opened, the DNRG Railroad reached Leadville from the Salida area. It had gone through the Royal Gorge to get there. In 1889, ASARCO bought the B&E smelter, changed its name to the Arkansas Valley plant, and operated it until 1960. Next slide. Well, all good things have to come to an end, I guess. There were several attempts during the 1870s to create a bimetallic standard for the U.S. and require the U.S. to buy silver so that we had a silver and gold currency. But even though there was an act passed in 1878 that required the government to purchase silver, very little was purchased during any of the Republican administrations because Hayes had originally vetoed that act, um, and it was actually overridden by Congress. So it went into effect, but he never appropriated any money to buy silver. So by 1890, things were getting fairly desperate, and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was passed by Congress and required the U.S. to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver a month, which was a lot. By August of 1890, the price had reached $1.17 an ounce, and the the silver people had always wanted silver pegged at 1/16 the price of gold. So if gold was $20 an ounce, silver would be about $1.22 an ounce. So the price actually after the Purchase Act reached almost that amount, but it didn't last. The Eastern business interests and banking and financial industry hated the purchase of the silver. They felt like it devalued U.S. currency and made it more difficult for international trade. So in the spring of 1893, there was a major stock market crash, Eastern Railroad failures, bank failures, and the silver price crashed at the same time. So on August 8th, Congress repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So no more silver was being bought by the federal government to subsidize the silver industry. By the fall of 1893, more than 300 Colorado silver mines had closed. More than 10,000 Colorado miners were unemployed. By September of 1893, the Leadville miners actually took a pay cut just so they could continue with having jobs. And in the spring of 1894, silver reached 61 cents an ounce, which would be exactly half of that $1.22 that it was supposedly worth if it were 1/16 the price of gold. So anyway, all of that was a huge political issue that lasted until the 1896 presidential election, when the Democratic National Convention couldn't quite settle on somebody to run as their candidate for president against William McKinley. And but they let William Jennings Bryan, an ex-congressman from Nebraska, give the final speech of the night. And he gave a rabble-rousing speech where he proclaimed that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold, talking about the gold standard. And the Democratic National Convention went wild and they nominated Bryan for their presidential candidate. Next slide. Okay, well, here we can see what happened with Leadville silver production. And that previous slide was partly to lead into this slide, because 1878 was when the act was over, the Congress overrode the Hayes veto on the Silver Purchase Act of 1878. And that's right here. So although the government wasn't really purchasing any silver, Leadville production increased significantly in those following years. In 1880, it reached its all-time peak of about 10 million troy ounces. And then it dropped a little bit. It would go up and down for a period of time. And then it started that decline that went all the way until shortly after the Silver Purchase Act was enacted. It went up for a few years, but then you had the 1893 depression. What's interesting is that it actually went up from there for several years. And there's a number of reasons for that. One was the pay cut that the miners took, so production costs were lower. One was that a lot of the mines turned to producing a lot more lead and zinc, um, and selling that on the market. And so the silver was essentially a byproduct of increased lead zinc production. There were several other reasons. By 1895, which is that next peak year after 1880, the Yak Tunnel had opened in Leadville. It drained about 3.5 miles of tunnel drained a significant part of the eastern part of the Leadville mining district down into California Gulch. And they were able not only to go deeper, but to cut their haulage costs because they were able to haul out of the Yak Tunnel to the Resurrection Mill instead of having to lift everything up shafts up, 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet vertically, which was much more expensive. So it peaked in 1895 and then started a slow decline. 1897 was when McKinley took office. He won on a gold platform. And then you had another short run around 1900, and then it just dropped from there all the way up until the 1920s. Some things happened that affected it along the way, like World War I. So the mines at that time started producing a significant amount more lead zinc ore for the war effort than they did silver ore. And silver essentially became a byproduct. Okay, next slide. Well, just to add a little human interest, I guess, to the Leadville story, I threw in this slide about Horace Tabor. Horace bought and sold several mines, including the Little Pittsburgh, his share of the Little Pittsburgh, and the Chrysolite mine. And eventually he wanted to own a whole mine all by himself. He didn't want any partners. So he bought the Matchless mine. And for a while it was pretty matchless. He was making $2,000 a day from it in 1880. And by 1881, he was the richest man in the state and the fifth richest in the nation. But he was having some marital problems at home. He decided that he wanted to divorce Augusta because she just didn't want to spend all that money he had. She was much more conservative than he was. And then he met Baby Doe and managed to get a secret divorce in Durango in 1883 because Augusta wouldn't consent to a divorce. And he secretly married Baby Doe. But Augusta finally gave up even after she sued him for support. And he then had a second marriage to Baby Doe in a huge wedding ceremony in Washington, D.C. She appreciated his riches more than Augusta had and helped him spend it. He built the Opera House in Leadville, the Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver. They had a bank in Leadville. He actually became the lieutenant governor of Colorado from 1878 to 1884. And then was a senator for a month, filling out the end of a senator's term who had resigned to become a cabinet secretary. And they lived a great life. They had two children and huge mansion. And then in 1893, the Sherman Act was repealed. By 1896, they were bankrupt. Here he had been a lieutenant governor and a senator, and just out of pity, Denver appointed him the Denver postmaster in 1898, but he died a year later broke. He'd lost all of his money. There was a story that was invented back in the 1940s by Carolyn Bancroft that his dying words to Baby Doe were, "Hold on to the matchless." And they had already lost the matchless, but I guess Carolyn didn't make that connection. But she did live, just through the charity of its owners, in the old tool shed at the Matchless Mine for the next 35 years. And she was accepting some charity from the local grocer because she couldn't pay for groceries. She lived for another 35 years after, 36 years after Horace died, but was found frozen to death at the Matchless in 1935. And just in case you're wondering about Augusta, she actually invested very wisely, not in mining properties. She actually used the mansion in Denver as a boarding house and boarded as many as 14 tenants in the mansion. She got cancer, I think, in 1894 and went out to Pasadena, California. And she died out there, and her son brought her back to Denver, and she left him $1.5 million in her estate. So she made out a whole lot better than Horace and Baby Doe did at the end. Next slide. Okay, well, what happened at the same time as the Leadville bust and the repeal of the Sherman Act was that they found gold in a place that was completely outside the mineral belt on the backside of Pikes Peak. So the only real Pikes Peak or bust gold rush that didn't occur in 1858, 59. It occurred in 1893. So next slide. Next slide. Barbara? Thank you. Okay. It was an unlikely person who found the Cripple Creek district. But for 10 years, Cowboy Bob Womack worked on a ranch on the west side of Pikes Peak, and he prospected all the creeks on his days off. He was pretty persistent doing it for 10 years, but finally in 1890, he found some gold on a little creek called Cripple Creek. And let some people in the area know. People in Colorado Springs got wind of it, and a carpenter by the name of Winfield Scott Stratton began prospecting some of the other parts of that area, and he struck a rich vein of gold on July 4th, 1891, in the area that's now the Victor area, just south of Cripple Creek. And so he named his mine the Independence, based on the amount of gold that was coming out of the Independence. In 1892, a new Pikes Peak gold rush began, and the area was just covered with miners from all over. But obviously, the ones from Colorado Springs got there first, so they staked some of the best claims. So a lot of the later fortunes of people like Spencer Penrose that built the Broadmoor Hotel came from the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. In 1890, Stratton sold the Independence for $11 million. Pretty good money back then. And built a big house in Colorado Springs and did a lot of charitable work because he had been poor for so long that he wanted to help the lower class that didn't have the advantages that the money brought him. Next slide.
Okay, also 5 minutes, Steve.
Okay, we'll get through it. Okay, here's a map of the district showing Cripple Creek in the upper left and Victor at the bottom in the lower right, and all of those little towns and mines in between the two. There's Cripple Creek in 1896, reached a population of 10 million in 1900. Next slide. Here's what Cripple Creek did for gold production in Colorado. I drew the orange line, but you can see 1893 is the beginning of the line. There was a little bit of a downturn in 1907 because of the panic. Then World War I, there was a tremendous drop during the war because gold wasn't a priority. In 1933, there was a little bit of a rise because the Roosevelt administration raised the price of gold from $20 to $35 an ounce. But 1942 basically killed the industry because the war order during World War II closed all the gold mines for the duration. And you can see that it just kind of went downhill from there and never recovered. Next slide. In 1949, the railroad to Cripple Creek was pulled up, and the mill in Colorado Springs that milled all the ore from Cripple Creek at that time was closed down. A custom mill did open the following year in Cripple Creek, or between Cripple Creek and Victor. But you can see the population of Cripple Creek that had been 10,000 was now down to 614. Next slide. The Portland was the last big mine to close in 1961. And that's a photograph of the Portland, right up on the hill above Victor. And so that was the way it was left for more than 30 years. But in 1995, the Cripple Creek and Victor open pit mine opened, and they started using cyanide heap leach, just like the gold mines out in Nevada use. Next slide. And this is what the district looks like now. You got Cripple Creek in the upper left and Victor in the lower right, and everything in between, about 2 miles east to west and 3 miles north south, is a gold mine. It now produces about 260,000 ounces, or around $475 million a year from that mine. Next slide. Okay, what's next? Well, a gold bust, possibly. The reserves at Cripple Creek and Victor are only projected to last until 2025. A silver boom, not very likely. Silver's probably never going to come back in Colorado because it's a byproduct of mining of too many other metals. And Leadville won't come back because it was remediated under Superfund as a Superfund site. And so new mining's pretty remote in Leadville. And as far as new discoveries, as far as I know, and can find out, there is no exploration currently planned outside any of the existing mining districts. And I don't think very many people are going to try to explore outside the mineral belt to begin with. And it's been pretty thoroughly explored in the last 150 years. Next slide. And that's the end. Here's some references if anybody's interested.
Thank you
And
very much.
I guess I'll take questions, huh? Is that allowed?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay.
Steve, let me ask one, if you're okay. I came across an old map the other day for a mine in Leadville, way up at the cirque at the end of Iowa Gulch, I think it is, but it's called the Continental Chief Mine.
Yeah.
And I can remember in the 1960s walking around the place. It was pretty much a ruin. But the last time I was in Leadville, which was I think on the way to Telluride or something for the mining history conference, they told me that the Sherman mine had been on that site. Is that true? Do you know?
Wasn't the Sherman the one that tried to put a tunnel through the divide over to the hilltop?
It might have. I don't know much about the Sherman, so
If that
but
was,
it is
if
up
that
in
was
that
the
gulch.
one, yeah. If that was, if that's the same mine, then that was the one that they were trying to connect, and I think did connect to the hilltop mine.
Okay.
I don't know. Look up the Sherman mine and see if
Yeah.
that could be the same one.
Okay, I think Sam was the next one on. I've got on.
Yes, I have a question. Who were the power brokers in Washington who were pushing all these things to drive up the price of silver? Because I wouldn't have thought Colorado or people in Colorado would have had enough influence to do that.
It wasn't just people from Colorado, but one of the senators in Congress was Teller, who ended up becoming Secretary of the Interior under Hayes, and he was a fairly powerful senator who spent a lot of years in the Senate after that. And it wasn't just Colorado, though, that was pushing it, because you had silver produced in Nevada. You had silver produced in Idaho. I mean, the northern Idaho silver mines were going great guns by the 1880s and 90s. A lot of silver was being produced all over, but it wasn't just the mining interests that were pushing it. The idea of free coinage of silver was adopted by a lot of the agricultural interests, and that's kind of where the Populist Party came from. The agriculturalists needed more currency. There was, on a gold standard, there's not a whole lot of currency circulating, and so the agricultural interests in places like Nebraska, where William Jennings Bryan was from, combined with all those mining interests, and so it was effectively the West and the South against the East and Midwest. And the East and Midwest had the population and the votes in both Congress and in in presidential elections. They had the electoral count, so they were able to continue to push a single gold standard despite all the populist pressure to try to bring about a free coinage of silver.
Thank you.
Does
Okay,
that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. Yes.
Okay.
Michael Cox is next.
I think Minor Mike was ahead of me, Mr. Cass.
Oh, he answered mine, Mike. So
Oh.
go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I guess there's a way to lower the hand. I was just I'm new to the group. Hi. I was just wondering if you had any fun stories about the Sylvanite and that whole episode. You know, where because that was always an interesting aspect of Cripple Creek to me, that they were chucking gold away because they didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem was that, I mean, one of the reasons that Cripple Creek was found so late was because it was gold tellurides in a, essentially an old, the richest part of it was an old breccia pipe from a volcano. It was relatively similar to some of the South African gold, and nothing like anything else in Colorado. So yeah, it was very difficult to realize that they really had gold there. That's not really answering your question with the story, but if you want to go ahead and tell the story, please feel free.
Oh no, I was just curious. That it's been too long for me, but I'm sure all sorts of tales were made up about this stuff and who actually figured it out. But
Yeah.
I would imagine it was a little more boring, and there was a metallurgist behind the whole thing.
Well, and that's the thing. By 1893, the School of Mines was going strong. There were plenty of metallurgists in Colorado, not just one like Hill that had to go to Germany and Swansea to be able to find out how to do smelting. So I think that, I think another factor is that by 1893, both the chlorination and cyanide processing of gold ore was beginning to be adopted in places like the Black Hills and other parts of Colorado. So you did have metallurgical processes that were much more efficient than the kind of smelting that they've been doing prior to that.
Did they here in California, the mercury is a big issue, and they're just obliterating everything. I mean, they bury it to where there's not even a piece of wood left.
Yeah.
Is that Colorado having the same problem?
I think that probably in some of these Superfund sites like Leadville and the Silverton area, that's probably true. The difference is that we didn't produce much mercury here in Colorado. California did produce a lot of mercury.
Yep.
Texas produced some mercury, but
Well, yeah, a
there
lot
wasn't
of our gold.
there wasn't a lot of cinnabar here. But as far as the recovery process for the gold, that was all over the place, because that was the only really relatively effective way after they used a stamp mill to separate the gold.
Sure. Yeah, here they it was mostly amalgamation until after, about the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I as an undergraduate, we had a chem teacher that loved Cripple Creek. And he'd have a banjo player come and play for the class, and then he'd show us specimens of sylvanite.
I never had any professors like that at the School of Mines.
It was great. We really enjoyed it. Take care.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out to people that the picture that Steve was using to illustrate Horace and Baby Doe was actually from the Ballad of Baby Doe opera, and Baby Doe was being played by Beverly Sills. If y'all remember Beverly being on Carol Burnett's show a lot.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Dwayne Smith, the
Yep. Dwayne was
tailor in Leadville. He did a first person impersonation.
Yep. Any other?
At the Opera House.
And they've since started they've been working on the Opera House. I don't know where they are but I remember seeing some pictures just a year or so ago of point tucking the outside. So hopefully the Opera House will remain standing. Anybody else with questions or anything to say? Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. And if people want to stay on and chat with each other, we can. I mean, there's several people here who don't make it every month here. So if you see somebody that you haven't chatted to for a while, you're welcome to stay on. Our next, oh gosh, I didn't keep it handy. Does anybody remember what our next, what March is? What's March? March is.
I Barb, yeah, it's Rock Springs, the rest of the story.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Rock Springs, the rest of the story.
Right.
So that'll be it's the Ides of March. So, almost perfect. And then in April, it's English steam pumping engines. Where'd you go? There's Keith. And then I didn't have room in the newsletter to put May. I kind of ran out of room. But May, it will be our wonderful secretary will be doing his mining and reality shows, being in reality shows, something like that. He's on his movies and mining kick. So that should be a fun one too in May. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for joining us this month and hope to see you next month.
Great job, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome.